Welcome once again to the Perspectives in Global Development Seminar. It's a series of weekly talks that reflect diverse perspectives in development issues. Scholars, innovative practitioners, policymakers, and others join us here in Ithaca or online each week to share their observations and ideas, to provide insights from their work, and to provide reflection, to provoke reflection, I should say, further examination of claims and evidence, and debate. Our fall semester series began 1 week ago when Purvi Mehta, head of Global Climate Adaptation Programming at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, spoke about inclusivity in programs seeking to address food insecurity. That recorded talk is now posted, along with other talks from recent years on our seminar website, and we encourage you to peruse those. Today's speaker is Farhana Sultana, a professor in the Department of Government, or Geography, and Environment in the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University, where she is also the research director for environmental collaboration and conflicts at the Program for Advancement of Research on Conflicts and Collaboration. Dr. Sultana is an interdisciplinary scholar whose work connects the study of political ecology, water governance, climate justice, post-colonial development, social and environmental justice, decolonizing knowledge, and transnational feminisms. Prior to joining Syracuse, she taught at King's College London and worked at UNDP. Dr. Sultana was awarded the Glenda Laws Award from the American Association of Geographers for outstanding contributions to geographic research on social issues in 2019. Please join me in welcoming Farhana Sultana.
Thank you so much for the generous introduction, and I hope everyone can see and hear me. And I really want to thank the program in global development at Cornell and the colleagues who've all worked together to bring this to fruition. And my apologies, I could not be there with you in person as originally planned. And thank you all for joining us today in person and online. So what I want to do is talk through a few materials that have come out recently, some of my publications, which I'll be happy to share at the end, and also put it in the Zoom talk. What I want to do is basically draw from a kind of more of a conceptual framing in understanding how do we battle various climate injustices. So amid growing ecological crises and climate-influenced worsening disasters, the need to confront systems that perpetuate and exacerbate impacts appear to be a unanimous global desire. Yet that is simply not the case. As I've argued in recent years, that climate coloniality disrupts simplistic narratives of climate justice. Climate coloniality reproduces the hauntings of colonialism and imperialism through climate impacts largely in the post-colony, or what is currently known as developing world, or the global south, located primarily in the tropics and subtropics, where climate-induced disasters and shifts have been prevalent for a very long time. And this complicates climate politics at both global and local scales. What climate change does is it bears the colonialism of not only the past, but an ongoing coloniality that governs and structures our lives, which are co-constitutive of processes of capitalism, imperialism, and international development. The uneven and unequal vulnerabilities and marginalizations of deaths and destructions that are often taken for granted draw attention to the continuities from the past and on to the present. And this forms of various forms of slow and fast violence. So the alternative epistemologies and cosmologies that emerge from lived experiences that were historically devalued in Eurocentric modernity and climate coloniality require us to decolonize epistemic violences and material outcomes for meaningful justice. So by weaving through these mediations, what I want to do today is offer an understanding of climate coloniality that is theorized and grounded in lived experiences. But I also want to demonstrate that confronting climate coloniality involves reconstituting individual and collective memories and consciousness for reconciliation liberation, and that therefore forms the basis of what I called careful climate revolutions. So how do we understand climate coloniality? So to briefly put, as various scholars have argued, the coloniality is the lived experiences that express the complexities of colonialities of power and the ongoing and enduring assaults of colonialism through modernity, capitalism, neocolonialism, imperialism, and international development processes. As theorized by scholars such as Anibal Quijano and Walter Mignolo, coloniality relies on racial domination and hierarchical power relations established during active colonization, but ongoing in post-colonial space times, where the colonial matrix of power persists. So I argue that climate coloniality occurs where Eurocentric hegemony, neocolonialism, racial capitalism, uneven consumption, and military domination end up co-constituting climate impacts that are experienced variously and differently and across differently racialized populations, who are then increasingly made more vulnerable over time. This also thereby makes them more disposable and places them in categories of sacrificial zones. This disposability that increases the climate devastations that are experienced both in homelands of people, but then also those who are increasingly displaced as migrants, both internally within their home countries and often transnationally. And this further curtails self-determination and future rights of generations. So ongoing climate coloniality is expressed insidiously in various forms of othering, dispossessions through capitalist extractivism and commodification, rapacious displacement and destruction of homelands, and the ongoing creation of sacrifice zones that only perpetuate greater and more exponentially unknown harms from more powerful climate-induced hazards and ecosystem destruction. But context matters for understanding coloniality, so we should never understand it as some abstract analysis of the racialization of difference, but of one that accounts for local, embodied, material, and lived experiences of knowing subjects. But the historical differences that position imperial countries overall at greater advantages over post-colonial and occupied countries mean that the colonial logics of extractivism continue through not only various forms of globalization and trade, but development interventions post-World War II. The unequal ecological exchange that follows, therefore, from the developing world to the advanced industrialized world through ongoing extractive capitalism and imperial structures of global trade and domination of agendas and policies, whether it's through the World Trade Organization or bilateral institutions, all end up ultimately to work to maintain climate coloniality. And here I use heuristic tools or analytical categories of global north and global south, but also recognize that these are also geographical spaces marked by heterogeneity and historical differences. So various scholars have tried to quantify this unequal ecological exchange that occurs under the name of trade and development and globalization, but they have also called it the ongoing colonial plunder of resources from the global south to the global north. And this therefore contributes to the overdevelopment of the global north at the expense of the former. These are not new arguments. These were made by scholars many decades ago, such as Walter Rodney. What we're seeing right now is that various forms of ongoing colonial patterns of harm and dispossession that are being fueled through various forms of climate coloniality and disasters and ecosystem degradation. But these have various forms of cumulative impacts as climate-related tragedies only ever expand. As a result, the undifferentiated humanity that is assumed in persistent narratives of the Anthropocene simply does not exist. And we know that these kinds of overt and covert experiences of ecological and climatic destruction are often creeping and episodic, but they can also articulate with economic growth ideologies that reproduce various forms of harms to countries, but then also communities within countries that are aspiring to develop. Climate coloniality is perpetuated through land grabs and water grabs, deforestation for growth, neoliberal conservation projects, fossil fuel warfare, new green revolutions for agriculture, rare earth mineral mining, and carbon offsetting programs for the wealthy that dispossess the historically impoverished elsewhere, often out of sight. These interventions have been called various names and have various tenors. They're often called green colonialism or carbon colonialism or fossil capitalism, but they have similar outcomes of domination, displacement, degradation, and impoverishment. Extractivism propagated by global capital and state-sanctioned interventions perpetuate geopolitics of climate necropolitics within and beyond borders. However, after decades of evidence of escalating climate impacts and these various forms of necropolitical control, there has been very little mitigation in reducing the basics of greenhouse gas emissions across the world that are only perpetuating these forms of harm. Some scholars have called this climate apartheid. This various forms of socio-spatial differentiation and who pays the disproportionate price of climate breakdown and thereby are made expendable, and those who are spared largely now or until recently, as we've seen climate impacts exponentially grow even in places like the US and Canada. But we're seeing are these complex layers of abjection and precarity, uncertainty and exhaustion and trauma amongst those who have been historically and increasingly deemed disposable. At the same time, it becomes imperative to recognize the differential intersectionalities within communities and how harms can be reproduced at various scales. So we know that co-production of racial capitalism, heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, and imperialism continue to operate in different ways, often supported by local elites and community members who can be complicit in the very communities that are trying to resist. This confluence of global and local power imbalances and uneven creation of vulnerabilities and production of risks end up merging global climate breakdown with scalar intersectional patterns of planetary factors of suffering from the globe to ecosystems to the body. And therefore, we have much more complex tapestries of outcomes in different contexts. So what does this do? What coloniality does is it discursively limits the terms of global debate. It tends to hegemonize knowledge of and about climate change and what actions are possible. And this ends up destroying other epistemologies and methodologies. The hierarchical power relations of knowledge production are maintained in this enduring colonial matrix of power, and cognitive coloniality is maintained through a colonization of the mind in terms of what is knowable and what is valuable to know, and this coexists with epistemic violence in knowledge production and valuation of expertise, including devaluing feminist, anti-colonial, decolonial, and anti-racist insights drawn globally. Because Eurocentrism has internalized a form of racism and colonialism, but that knowledge has now gone global and is normalized, how climate change is talked about, the planning that is pursued to tackle it, and the dominant education around it, therefore conform to patterns of domination and control. A lack of cognitive justice and epistemic decolonization is perpetuated in the reinforcement of climate coloniality with the hegemonization of narratives, epistemologies, and climate solutions. So therefore, what I posit is to decolonize climate. And in our efforts to understand or better implement climate justice, we need to reframe narratives around climate change. And the way I argue this is that there are two parts of it. Epistemology and materiality simultaneously are central. What this means is both knowledge production and epistemological framings, but also engaging with the material praxis of material outcomes and lived experiences. To decolonize climate at a basic level is to integrate more of the various forms of critiques and scholarship and struggles that are often sidelined in mainstream climate discourses and practices, because they allow us to redress ongoing oppressions and marginalizations. Fundamentally, though, decolonizing necessitates the critical interrogations of complexities of empire, of imperialism, of capitalism, and then how to decenter them and dismantle them. It also confronts and addresses material outcomes of framing and reframing. It internalizes a material praxis that takes co-production seriously. It is not just about recognizing problems, but working towards distributive justice, reparations, and restitutions. However, what we see are often unreflexive celebrations of the transformative potentials, and this does no one any favors. It would be impossible to deny the conformity and uniformity that international development and global capitalism and globalization try to systemically instill everywhere, or how capitalism reinvents itself through the various crises it produces, both materially and discursively. The shrinking spaces of being otherwise and doing differently need to be acknowledged. Still, it is increasingly evident that maintaining racial and class privileges at a global scale are impossible in decolonizing climate justice. And this is one of the important tasks at hand. Liberation comes from destroying colonialism's impacts on lands, bodies, and psyches, to overcome the apocalypse that continues to be coloniality, or to borrow from Frantz Fanon, moving from alienation and dehumanization to self-realization in order to decolonize climate traumas. Healing the colonial wounds through transformative care, empathy, mutuality, and love hold possibilities, as Bell Hooks clearly articulated. And we desperately need to heal the colonial wounds everywhere. To achieve this concerted work that is needed on both the material and the political, and the discursive and epistemological, are necessary, while recognizing that these are but analytical categories for discussion and analysis, but are intricately intertwined in everyday life in socio-spatial scales. And what I want to do is just parse these out very quickly before bringing them together in the end. So if we turn to the material and the political first, we can think about the global scale for a moment to consider why there are persistent challenges to achieving any decolonized climate governance or climate ideologies and practices. Structural changes are necessary in international governance for equitable recognition and distributive justice to occur in and between countries. While desiring transformative and equitable systems exist, the inequities are reiterated in different countries and constituents and different places, such as the Conference of Parties or the COPs, the annual climate conferences that are held around the world and coming up in the Middle East very shortly. So therefore, what we see is a desire and an impotence that remains elusive. That's because contemporary governance systems are undergirded by centuries of colonial and imperial power structures and ideologies, whereby we have a global network of nation states, corporations, and elites that dominate discursive framings around climate and material outcomes therein. The challenges to and changes in this system are thereby resisted. Opposition to empire dying is manifested in resistance to shared governance, to accountability and transparency, and giving up control, because this often means a loss of existing and future material wealth and power. Nonetheless, different solutions and outcomes have been imagined and insisted upon thus far, even at places like the COP. Demands have been made of debt cancellation as part of climate reparations for countries of the global south, who have historically been impoverished and indentured through colonial imperial finance mechanisms and capitalist extractivism fueled by neoliberal global trade. Debates around climate reparations remain contentious, however, and loss and damage have only been recently acknowledged and currently being considered for sufficient financial support. But reparations are more than that. It's about supporting world making and material changes that account for histories of slavery and colonialism and imperialism across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, as novelists such as Amitav Ghosh have very eloquently written about. In confronting climate coloniality, the need therefore arises of being mindful of the goal of not only undoing centuries of harm and ongoing devastations through policies, finance, interventions, institutions, and the media that are insidious in everyday life, but also rebuilding and reconstituting in different ways, in more capacious and equitable ways. Scalar geographical analysis and critiques become essential for this, because we cannot confront crises and imagine co-creating solutions otherwise. A reworking of relationships becomes necessary across geopolitical scales, but also in human and non-human relationships. Therefore, valuing indigenous and traditional knowledge and sciences worldwide is essential as we try to understand the ways that border crossings for abolition justice mean reaping the rewards benefiting not only humans, but also non-human life. But we need to also look at the anti-colonial movements across Africa, Asia, and Latin America that are replete with struggles and examples for us to draw from. They link our ability to think globally, but also locally, and tie it to ongoing peasant-led resistance and indigenous movements against extractive, exploitative practices happening in many countries. So what becomes evident, therefore, is an urgent need for solidarities across front lines for decolonization, reformulation of institutions, and challenging power matrices across scales that end up shifting geopolitical harms, but then also help us envision and support creation of a livable planet for all. But in order to do this, it brings me to my second point, which is an epistemic decolonization and a recommitment to collective action that crosses borders and boundaries. So in conjunction with the material injustices, securitization of profit, and geopolitical planetary control, addressing the discursive and epistemologies of climate coloniality become very important. Imperialism is underpinned by colonial forms of racialization and race science, a devaluing of other knowledges, as Edward Said theorized, an orientalization of various marginalized populations, and the urgency to decolonize knowledge production, not only just about climate change, but how we understand our relationship through a nature-society dialectic becomes incredibly essential. One way to think about that is who is doing the talking. Often the talking heads around climate or trade or environmental protection tend to be the same pale, male, and stale. They're global north white male experts who dominate conversations in the media, in various policy agendas, in international institutions. But they're not the ones who've been experiencing long-standing climate devastations, nor producing necessarily place-based knowledge. This whitewashing of climate discourses and intellectual spaces is, of course, being increasingly critiqued. And what we know is that we need to therefore think about how we practice our citational practices, what epistemologies we teach as scholars and faculty, whose ontologies gets counted in our curriculum, but then also who is invited to speak, who is heard, who helps set agendas. It is not just about having a seat at the table, for instance, participating at a COP conference, but determining what that table is, or what decolonial scholars call setting the terms of the debate and the framings to have actual decision-making powers and setting the epistemologies and ontologies from which various policies are derived. But ultimately, what we require is a shift in the geopolitics of knowledge production and the reevaluation of expertise and who counts as the expert. So climate coloniality thereby is perpetuated through mundane and institutionalized ways of subalternization of non-Eurocentric, non-masculinist, and non-capitalistic understandings of ecology, nature-society relationships, of climate change, and of how we understand ourselves on this planet. Decolonizing educational systems, therefore, become fundamental because this is where systemic cognitive injustices are often perpetuated through formal, westernized, Eurocentric education that has gone global. Epistemic violence and colonization of the mind need to be acknowledged and undone across universities, training centers, non-government organizations, state institutions, and definitely the development industry. At the same time, it is an understanding of our own complicities in perpetuating harms and actively working to redress it through everyday praxis and re-education. So what I want to do is think about, why do we need to do this? And how does this help? How do we move forward? How do we undo what is at stake and then remake futures that are not haunted by the past and the present, knowing the harms that continue to exist? And here is why it is so important to pay attention to power that exists in the shadows. We need to forge solidarities and cultural continuity against great odds and support those who have continued to do so. If climate coloniality is a form of violence, I argue that what we need is careful, meaning full of care, not careful as in cautious, but careful and resplendent climate revolutions to counter the harms and the violences of climate coloniality, materially and epistemologically. And an ethics of care can help us foster those revolutionary vehicles for abolitionist climate praxis. Care here embraces but goes beyond the radical care of the self to encompass others, both human and non-human. It is care work that sustains all resistance movements and anti-colonial battles. It is also one that fosters collective and alternative politics and can envision new formulations. So while climate coloniality temporally and spatially causes eroding and erasure, there are also fissures that rupture through its weight, resist its imposition, and rework it. Multiple forms of knowledge may be excluded in hegemonic climate discourses and practices, but various cosmologies and decolonial knowledge and resistance that center the accountable, reciprocal, ethical, and careful relations and processes across the globe can help us think through what future can look like. In many ways, decolonization is thereby enacted, ranging from direct action, law changes, care network building, leapfrogging alliances, cultural resurgence, and one that recenters Black, Indigenous, and people of color futures. So for instance, why do we need to think about care work? We need to think about care work because it allows us to maybe make land Black claims because we care about what is happening. And it's also about supporting those who are trying to speak in their native tongue, rebuild collective memory and cultural rebuilding and retelling of historiographies, of celebrating human and non-human kinship, thinking about all the forms of valuing storytelling and reclaiming sacredness and developing counter stories and counter mapping, to think about strategies and oppositional tactics that allow people to defend territorial ontologies, but also recognize that relational entanglements and healing foster well-being and can revive convivialities that have historically been lost. To celebrate resurgence in cultural practices and art, in literature, oral tradition, poetry, and dance is to reclaim agency and desire and futurity and spirit. These examples are simultaneously coping strategies and mechanisms, but they're also refusals and decolonial and anti-colonial actions that we can have a hope from learning with and learning from. However, I really want to stress, it is vital not to fetishize prehistories or indigenous and local traditions as being frozen in time, or culture as some magical solution to systemic oppression, but recognize how they propel further revolutionary resistance, how their nurturance can help us build from the ground up. And we can think about anti-colonial cultural praxis that fosters the fleshing out of theories and grounding of concepts. It is an affirmation of the humanity of the oppressed and of fostering radical equality and mutuality. In other words, agency and corporeality of the colonized come to matter. Realities and concerns of those caught up in epistemic entanglements and frictions, as Anna Singh talks about, need to be worked through, where reconciling may not be entirely possible and differences can coexist. But that is the very point of pluriversality instead of universality, as argued by scholars such as Arturo Escobar and others. It is to make visible and draw attention to the knowledges and lived experiences, to ground theories in places geographically and ontology, as argued by scholars such as Maria Lugones and Gloria Andalzua. It involves valuing transgressive oppositional gaze from those within. It insists upon not just engaging with scholarship and bearing witness, but accepting on their own terms the lived experiences and testimonials of kin and ancestors, of family members, and of those who have historically been silenced and subjected to coloniality. These processes validate and give agency to the enunciating, embodied, and knowing subjects whose lived experiences, cosmologies, and knowledges matter. It involves us to decenter ourselves, of deep listening through the roars and the whispers and the silences that exist in the archives, in the landscape, in our own communities. It is through these processes that ethics of care networks, and prioritizing collective well-being instead of only individual well-being become more clarified. It accounts for embodied, ecological, economic, cultural, and political safety from harm. It helps us foster flourishing. It heals the colonial wound with transgressive love and solidarity to even become possible. Alienation is fought against with the reclaiming of sacredness and relationalities, in moving through liberation and self-determination without apolitically or ahistorically fetishizing or romancing the local, or fetishizing and romancing the community or the culture. There is increasing recognition that resurgence and renewal are possible by seeding the fertile grounds of the colonial wound to move beyond its conscription through strategies of revival. Or as Fanon reminds us, we need to dismantle colonial oppressive institutions and apparatuses for true liberation. This is a collective liberation, mind you, and not just emancipation. It is in this way that I argue that a care ethics holds the possibility of revitalizing a revolutionary potentiality against atmospheres of violence of climate coloniality. It is thereby restorative but open to transformation. It is not just restoring to what was, but a nurturing towards better. It is an iterative process, and it is not linear. Intentions and politics are reassessed throughout, requiring critical group and self-reflexivity of being in community. Processes are thus dialogic and praxis-based. It is recuperative in its nature against the violence of the mind. It is a renewal and restoration of dignity. Care and collectivity can foster pathways of decolonization that allow for the oxygenation of multiplicities of revolutions in the psyche. It is an affirmative nourishing of revolution through care and being in the world with others. And here I want to reiterate, the revolution here does not gesture towards endless cycles of violence or never-ending protest and resistance, but rather creating peace and well-being, of building conviviality and pluriverse. So our political action can be revolutionary when it leads to fostering recursive, careful, and collective well-being that is simultaneously social and ecological. There is thus a need to recuperate a recognition of co-produced emergence and its impermanence. It is a becoming and not an ending. The very possibility of this occurring is often where radical and revolutionary care work is often the most visible, becoming sutured into anti-capitalist acts or anti-colonial struggles. The mutual responsibilities that emerge through debate, critique, and action for careful climate praxis allow for further radical revolution of planetary mutuality to also be sites of critical hope. What is evident, therefore, is that a political liberation from climate coloniality for climate revolutions rely on various forms of allyship and solidarities that are intentional. And this intentional action requires a growth of a certain kind of political consciousness that has to be, in essence, informed by various strands of praxis and scholarship that draws from anti-colonial, decolonial, feminist, and anti-racist scholarship and movements. And as we try to build kinship across spaces and scales, we need to recognize that it can be fraught. It is a process that requires humility and humanity and overcoming alienation, of acknowledging differences and commonalities to build shared goals. The worlds we inhabit are, of course, full of complicity, of compromise and contradictions, of maintaining white supremacy and racial capitalism, of moves to innocence and guilt. So collective endeavors that are arrived through various intentional, concerted, and reflexive work has the hope of letting us do something better. It lets us build political community and practical solidarities that can build the reparative relationships that we need to restore humanity and agency in the battle against climate destruction. The ruthless extractions and dispossessions across territories showcase the connections across place-based materialities to broader extractive ideologies and the colonialist capitalist renditions of greed and dispossession. In other words, it is essential to pursue decolonization that is not some uncritical celebration of transnational solidarity devoid of material politics or intersectional analysis. It is exactly the opposite of that. But we need to recognize that there is no single blueprint for doing this because it is a process and not an event. It is in the many acts, small and large, acting in constellation and in collectivities over time that bear results. So I want to conclude my talk by basically pulling together the different strands that I started with. That colonialism still haunts not only our past and our present, but will haunt the future through ecological and climate breakdown. Imperialism continues through neocolonialism, racial capitalism, development interventions, various forms of education, training, and definitely the media. Climate coloniality is expressed in various forms, such as through fossil fuel capitalism, neoliberal growth models, and hyper-consumptive lifestyles. But it is also through structures and systems built and held in place by powerful alliances globally. Climate coloniality seeps through everyday life across space and time, weighing down and curtailing opportunities and possibilities through a toxic mix of rapacious extractivism, dispossession, debts, and heteropatriarchy. Domination and development that occurs therefore need to account for not only just climate change to be fixed through technology and finance, but a restructuring of relationships to ecologies, waters, lands, and communities that we are intimately, materially, and geopolitically connected to. As I have argued, that we need to therefore reveal, reassess, and dismantle the various structures and discourses and make them non-universal, demonstrate the hegemony of deploying historically the various particularized colonial practices and everyday tactics of oppression and empire building, and decolonizing climate, therefore, needs to tackle with complexities of colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, and development in the reproduction of colonialities so that we can foster various forms of climate revolutions. Thank you so much for listening to this talk, and my apologies, I went a little bit fast, but I did want to keep to time. So I'm mentioning here on the slide some of the publications that this talk drew from. They're all available on my website, which is my name. It is farhanasultana.com. And I'll go ahead and also provide these in the Zoom chat box for those of you who are joining us online. And thank you again for having me.
Okay. Question, comment? Okay, Ed?
Thank you very much, Professor. I have one question. I think I'm trying to break this down and understand what the implications might be for, say, a smallholder farmer in rural Malawi, Pakistan, Peru. Can you break this down on what the implications would be for somebody in that position?
So for the farmer, the small farmer, yes, in Malawi or Peru or somewhere, if I understood your question. So this analysis is very meta scale, right? It is macro and micro. So for the small farmer, because they're often disempowered through various processes, one thing that can happen is to figure out what other farmers are doing. The various farmers' movements are often the sources from which we can understand the needs of people on the ground. And there are peasant movements and farmers' movements in Latin America, like Via Campesina, and also we saw the large farmers' resistance movements a couple of years ago in India. And when we think about what can the various small-scale farmers do, given their position in the global trade process, I really want to stress that even though I did mention that sometimes small scale farmers feel disempowered, they're not. They often hold power, but in collectives. So how can they work with local leaders, local politicians, extension workers? Can their voices be heard? So, but instead of just putting the burden on the farmer, what I'm trying to hint at is that we really need to have people in power learn and understand what these needs are. It is a form of deep listening that is often missing. And that leads to the various kinds of policy changes. Because there are many farmers I've worked with who have expressed these very sentiments that I've presented in this talk, but they don't make it to the mainstream because they're not given those kinds of platforms. So it behooves those of us with various forms of privilege to account for the concerns of the smallholder farmers in terms of in what ways could their pricing be better? Are their crops yields suffering because of climate disasters? Are there ways that they could be better supported through social safety networks? What is important to various communities and different farming communities, wherever they may be located, without fetishizing who or what a farm or a farmer is? So I think what I'm trying to do is flip the question to show that it should not always be what is the role of the farmer, if I understood your question correctly, but my apologies if I didn't. But if you're thinking of what it means in terms of impacts, it just means increasingly worse climatic hazards for small-scale farmers in terms of heat stress and drought and lack of rainfall or precipitation, or too much precipitation in terms of flooding. So these kinds of issues therefore means connecting to the government agencies or non-government agencies or educational institutions that can help farmers get the kind of information they need for their livelihood strategy so that they can adapt without maladapting. If that answers your question, I'm glad. If not, I'm happy to elaborate further.
Comments? Okay, I have one, Farhana. You talked about co-creating solutions, building new solidarities, participation in setting the terms of the debate, and so on. You also mentioned that it's a process, not an event, small steps over time, as I understood it. But you also, began your talk with talk about the entrenchment of powerful interests and systems and institutions. So I'm wondering, in practical terms, how do you envision the co-creation of solutions coming about? How do the solidarities evolve? And how because it would seem like when we think about process over time, not an event, small steps, in the context of a system that you describe as, long-standing, powerful interest. It would seem as though it's hard to be optimistic about the prospects for a real change.
I take your point. It is hard to be optimistic, but if we quit, then we give up and all is lost, right? So my stance is that it is entirely possible to learn from various social movements, various resistance movements, but also remember history is replete with various forms of struggles that did overturn what, in the sense of David versus Goliath. Various forms of, revolutions have occurred where what seemed impossible became possible. So what happens is that there is often a kind of resistance to change, and then suddenly something happens very quickly. But for the longest time, it seems impossible. But we cannot control the time when it happens, or if it happens, or how quickly it will happen. And what this requires is to have that faith, I think, and this is where I draw from the work of Brazilian philosopher Paulo Freire, in terms of thinking of critical hope, which means a hope that derives from action and then reflection, and then you theorize and act again. So it is that consistent praxis that is reflexive of what needs to be done and how you can learn from others. But if we think about the solidarities that are necessary to push back against the entrenched powerful systems and governance structures, whether it is climate conferences, institutions, education, and so on, it means that we need to work together in terms of various disparate constellations. It is never one monolithic thing that brings about change, but it is a lot of things that come together. So for instance, we've seen after many years, US media and journalism pick up on climate reporting and more investigative journalism. But that is a generational shift, which means somebody had to have worried about it before to train the journalists now. And this resulted in a lot more critique of the fossil fuel capture of global governance systems and the continual misinformation and deflection and disinformation that powerful elites and fossil fuel corporations and elite governments have participated in for many, many decades. So, that in itself is helpful. But then we also can think about how did countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America push for, decolonizing, formal political decolonizing, not the epistemic and material one, right, in terms of establishing nation states. And those were never, you never win your freedom because somebody granted it to you. You win it because you fought for it. And we can think about the ways that these could perhaps be pointers of both maintaining a form of critical hope, but then also learning as learning lessons, I suppose, or opportunities to draw inspiration from. Because if we all felt that it was too overwhelming, and that apathy is exactly how we got to this current mess. It is that long-standing apathy that I'm small and I cannot do anything. Well, we all are small ants, but collectively we can form a mountain. And that is exactly why I start with why we need to decolonize educational systems, because this is where it starts. It starts with our students, it starts in the home, it starts in our communities, and then we leapfrog and link with others. And that is how you build and foster that collective resistance or resilience from harm, and not a resilience in that technocratic sense, which has been thoroughly critiqued.
Okay. Is it on? Oh, yes. Okay. Okay. Thank you so much for your talk. This question, I think, sort of builds on what you were just touching on. For, graduate or undergraduate students in this seminar, can you give any, I guess, concrete examples besides learning about this, obviously, and attending things like this, that students can do to start now? Because several students are years away from the workforce. So throughout their projects and class and everything, what would your suggestions be for right now that people can do?
Students can absolutely get involved in various forms of scholar activism. You can get involved in various groups. And this is not clicktivism. This is not the influential culture. This is actually doing the work, doing the labor. Figure out where can you get involved? Does your voice have political traction? Where can you lend support? In what ways could you become maybe a leader in doing something? I think I also want to not infantilize students, because a lot of the anti-colonial battles around the world came from the student movement. So students hold a lot of power, but it is recognizing how you hold the power together in solidarity as a collective and not necessarily individually. That might be the charismatic leader, but there are many ways you can do it besides just teaching yourself. But get involved, find out what other various groups are doing around the world.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sultana. We're out of time, but we appreciate you being here today.
Thank you for having me, and thank you all for joining and listening in.